Sheep are not native to the UK. Neolithic settlers actually brought them to Britain from Southwest Asia in about 3000 BCE. Sheepskin and other wool textiles appear in the archaeological record from the Bronze Age in northern Europe. Following the Norman Conquest, sheep became the dominant form of livestock in Britain. They primarily provided milk, with meat, wool and manure secondary products. But by the medieval era, the focus switched to wool, and I'm pretty sure that knitters everywhere are quite glad of that. Unsurprisingly, sheep appear in folklore through tales of sheep stealing, but also fables, like the wolf in sheep's clothing. And sheep appear in mythology. Look at the golden ram Aries, who saved Phrixus and Helle from their evil stepmother, who went on to both provide the famous Golden Fleece of Greek myth and the Aries constellation. But let's have a look at some of the legends and lore associated with sheep in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. We are kicking off a new theme as it is the beginning of a new month, and also as it is the 1st of February, happy St. Bridget's Day if you celebrate. And because we did the Folklore of Animals last year, and the episodes actually ended up being surprisingly more popular than I was expecting, I thought, well, let's have a look at the Folklore of Agricultural Animals, as we are obviously here in the Northern Hemisphere, at least heading towards spring. Before I forget, because otherwise I will, I am also doing a talk with Cresswell Craggs about the folklore of spring flowers, and the link is in the show notes if you're interested. That's not until March though, but I just thought I'd mention it while I remembered it was happening, because we know what I'm like, I'll forget otherwise. Now, I must admit, this has been a really interesting episode to look at, because we are looking at sheep, and I genuinely had no idea that there were so many folk remedies that involve sheep. So this episode is probably going to go to some quite weird places, but that's just what folklore is really, isn't it? But never mind. We are going to start off with the Herdwick origin story, and Herdwick sheep are a really famous breed found in the Lake District. They're also really cute, if you can describe sheep as such. And like I say, they have their own origin story, and this one comes from the area near the village of Drigg. And in this particular legend, storms drove the Spanish Armada around the western coast of mainland Britain. A galleon wrecked on the shore near Drigg and 40 sheep escaped. Now, thankfully, they actually managed to swim to shore, and when they ended up landing on the beach, the lord of the manor claimed them as flotsam and jetsam. I mean, because you would, wouldn't you? But it was these sheep, so says the legend, that became the ancestors of the Herdwick breed. Now, there is a different version that claims it was actually a Norse ship and not a Spanish one, which would obviously mean that they would have been here far longer if you then look at the Norse invasions instead. But author Beatrix Potter actually drew on both versions for her 1929 book, The Fairy Caravan. And in that, one of the sheep actually explains that the breed, and I quote, had ridged the slopes before the passing Romans, end quote. And that, and I quote, fresh blood came from Iceland, Spain or Scotland, end quote. So she's very much referencing this collection of myths about where Herdwick sheep actually came from. And I had no idea that she'd actually been the president-elect of the Herdwick Sheep Breeders Association. But there we go, we'll learn something new every day. Nowadays, Herdwick sheep are a common sight in the Lake District, and their fleece actually makes a really good yarn choice. It's better for outerwear, but it does actually take quite a long time to get wet, but it dries out so much more quickly than other types of wool. So Herdwick yarn, definitely a good one to have a look at for things like jackets or jumpers and hats and things that are probably more likely to get wet and so on. Now, I did mention earlier that you do get a lot of stories around sheep stealing in particular, and there's a really bizarre form of, I'm going to call it urban legend, although obviously it's actually like the rural equivalent of an urban legend, which does actually involve sheep stealing. And the version I'm going to tell you comes from Northumberland, because we all know that I'm biased, but this one comes from the Denham Tracts, and it allegedly took place in Catton, Allendale, and it very much proves why crime does not pay. So in this particular version of the story, a particular sheep thief lived in the area and plagued farmers with his light-fingered ways around their flock. Try as they might to discover his identity, the farmers were absolutely none the wiser as to who to suspect. Now, eventually, the thief's own methods actually proved his undoing, because he stole the sheep by tying their legs together, and then he would sort of poke his head in between the feet and the body and carrying them around on his shoulders. So obviously he could only steal one at a time, but to be fair, that probably made it a bit easier to hide what he was doing. But on the last trip to a neighbour, he stole a sheep that was a bit heavier than he was used to, so in order to take a little bit of the weight off, he balanced the sheep on a stone pillar. The problem was he didn't take the sheep off his shoulders, so of course the sheep, which was probably quite unnerved at being balanced on a pillar, then started to struggle. So it slid off the stone, but of course because it sort of slid backwards away from him, the rope that was around its feet then dug in under the thief's jaw, and the locals found him the next day strangled by his own rope. I must admit what became of the sheep is unknown, but he does essentially then get almost garroted, I guess, by the thing that he was trying to steal in the first place. And you don't see that in Shaun the Sheep. As I said at the beginning, it is more likely that that tale is more of a legend rather than something based in fact, because it also appears across 25 other sites in England and Wales. There's a similar tale featuring a deer rather than a sheep in Leicestershire, and I would also argue there is the version that I told when I was on Lawman, which is basically where a body snatcher's bounty, which obviously in this case would be a body in a sack, ends up hanging him over a wall in Sunderland. So it's basically a bit of a warning that stealing doesn't pay. Leslie Grinsell actually points out that sheep stealing had long been punishable by death due to the importance of sheep farming to the economy, but despite that, judges often commuted the death sentence to transportation, which, let's be honest, in itself could also be a death sentence. Now, between 1825 and 1831, 1,039 death sentences out of 9,316 were actually for sheep stealing, so that is a lot of sheep getting stolen. But I did also say that this episode was going to go to some weird places, and I think that's probably where we're at now. And this is the sheep remedies section, and I had no idea that there was such a thing as like sheep folk medicine, and that is not folk medicine for sheep, that is medicine involving sheep. And it goes back some way. So if we look at the old French collection known as the Gospels of Distors, and I've no idea how you pronounce that because I've literally only seen it written down, but it translates to the Distaff Gospels, sheep could actually affect a smallpox cure. Now, bearing in mind this particular book was knocking about in the 15th century, it tells you how long ago this particular remedy was collected. But if a woman caught smallpox, her husband needed to buy her a black lamb and then bind her in its skin. Once he'd done this, he would then make a pilgrimage to St. Radegund, where he would then make offerings to the saint, and with any luck, his wife would heal. Now, St. Radegund was a Thuringian princess and Frankish queen, and she founded the Abbey of the Holy Cross at Poitiers, and she actually cared for the sick there, with some considering her a gifted healer, which would explain why you would go on a pilgrimage to her. But some belief in the curative properties of sheepskin actually persisted, since an early 19th century remedy claimed that wrapping a naked person in sheepskin that was still warm from being removed from the animal would cure lameness, among other things. Even in 1912 in Herefordshire, a child was placed inside a warm sheepskin to try to cure an adder bite. By the 1860s, the remedy evolved to putting parts of the sheep on the soles of the person's feet. So in Leicestershire, one remedy claimed putting a sheep's melt on the soles of the feet would pretty much cure anything, while in Huntingdonshire, putting the skirt of a sheep on the soles of the feet cured typhus. And this is where you come in, because I've googled literally everywhere and I cannot find what the sheep's skirt or the sheep's melt refer to. So if you know, please do let me know in the comments or message me on social media, because it is really annoying me. I did put sheep's melt into Google and I got a whole load of adverts for sheep wax melts. Who knew that you could get that many wax melts in the shape of sheep? The things I end up Googling for this podcast. But yeah, literally no idea what they refer to. There was also a belief from Abergavenny in Wales which specified sheep's lights should be tied to the feet to cure pneumonia. Now I googled that one, and lights are lungs, and the grandmother that practiced the cure said that holes would appear in the lights as the inflammation reduced. So it would definitely make sense to use sheep's lungs in that regard if you're trying to cure pneumonia, which is obviously going to affect the lungs. According to whoever collected the folklore, the holes did actually appear as the inflammation reduced, so it did appear to actually work. But it did then make me wonder if the sheep's melts were also a different form of offal. Somebody referred to it being a sheep's tail, but I was wondering if it could also be internal things as well, because obviously elsewhere lights can also refer to other bits of offal as well. Now, by the 1890s, an out of Hebrides remedy saw a black sheep put over painful joints to help ease rheumatism, but by this point the sheep was still alive, so that sounds like a much nicer way of dealing with your painful joints. And I get quite a lot of joint pain, and I sort of think, yeah, could I basically just like have a black sheep sit on us to get them to go off? Probably be a bit better than ibuprofen, but never mind. Now, I did obviously mention just before that a pneumonia remedy that involved offal, but there was actually a much nicer remedy from Somerset which involved a flock of live sheep, and this one was recorded in 1851. And if you had children with respiratory ailments, the remedy recommended that you should carry them through a flock of sheep in the morning as early as possible. You could also purify a house where the entire family had died from fever with a flock of sheep. And an Irish remedy recorded by Lady Wilde, so we do have to wonder exactly how widespread this was, but never mind, claimed that driving the sheep into the house and then actually letting the sheep sleep there for 3 nights would leave the house safe for human habitation. Elsewhere in the 1920s, people took children who were suffering from whooping cough to a spot on Easton Tor where the sheep huddled for shelter. Now, they thought it was actually the sheep's smell that would cure the disease. Likewise, in 1966, another belief claimed that you could actually put a whooping cough patient in front of a sheep and it was the sheep's breath that would cure the disease. Alternatively, a Devon cure for whooping cough involved a field covered in dew. So what you would do is you would take the suffering child to the field early in the morning, you would encourage a sheep to get up from wherever it had been lying during the night, and you would roll the child on the spot where the sheep had been lying. Now, obviously, here in the 21st century, you can use antibiotics to treat whooping cough. You don't have to go around annoying sheep in fields. And obviously, whooping cough can be really, really dangerous for infants. So you can also use things like vaccines as well to prevent it during childhood. So you don't have to go around annoying any neighbourhood sheep. Now, it was also quite interesting to note when there was that idea about using them in Devon as a cure, people also believed it was lucky to part a flock of sheep that you encountered. So obviously, you would kind of walk through the middle of them. Meanwhile, in Somerset, people believed it was lucky to meet a flock of sheep and even better to make your way through the middle of the flock. There's also a belief recorded in 1950s Glasgow that claimed that saying, "Good morning, Mr. Sheep," to the first sheep you encountered meant you would receive a surprise parcel. Whether that parcel comes from the sheep or not, I'm not quite sure, but there we go. And I also wanted to include 2 notable examples of sheep in pre-Raphaelite art, and they're both by William Holman Hunt, who, to be honest, is my favourite of the pre-Raphaelites. And obviously I have got a whole month worth of pre-Raphaelite art episodes and how folklore appears in them. But these 2 particular paintings are the Hireling Shepherd from 1851 and Our English Coasts / Strayed Sheep from 1852. And Hunt actually painted them one after the other. There are various meanings available for the paintings, but a biblical theme does emerge in both thanks to the presence of the sheep. And I'm going to put on screen, if you're watching this on YouTube, an image of the Hireling Shepherd because it's actually in the collection of Manchester Art Gallery. And in this particular painting, you can see that the shepherd is so distracted by a beautiful woman that he pays absolutely no attention to his flock behind him. One of them's even wandering off towards the wheat field in the background. And essentially, they're doing whatever they want because nobody's actually paying attention to them. I can't include an image of strayed sheep because Tate Britain claimed the copyright of the image and they wanted to charge £95 for me to license it to include it here. So instead, I've put a link to that in the show notes. But in that particular painting, you've got a flock of sheep who are straying dangerously close to the edge of a cliff. There's no shepherd in the composition at all. And on one hand, that painting references the complete lack of defences along England's coastline, and that was following a wave of revolutions in Europe in 1848. But on the other hand, it also depicts a flock without a leader, which referenced the lack of strong spiritual leadership for the public. And I just thought it was really interesting because Holman Hunt himself isn't necessarily a particularly religious person, but you do get quite a lot of religious themes in his paintings, often around the idea that essentially, like, the sheep are looking for a shepherd, obviously us being the sheep, and I'm sure you can guess who he meant the shepherd should be. Now, shepherds did actually accrue their own traditions because obviously there were a group of workers who basically had nothing to do with other farm workers, and even after other workers abandoned wearing smocks, shepherds continue to do so, and sometimes they would take up wood carving or they might snare wild birds to pass the time while they were watching their flock. And people also buried shepherds holding a tuft of wool because that way, when they finally reached the pearly gates, they could prove why they'd often miss church on Sundays. And I think that's quite a lovely little superstition as well. So ultimately, what do we make of this folklore of sheep? Now, obviously, this is basically what I found when I went looking for sheep folklore. And there are obviously other legends available. Like I said at the beginning, there's the origin story of Aries, but he's also in my Zodiac collection of episodes. So if you're more interested in things to do with Aries, there's a fuller version of the legend in that one. But I think what struck me with this one was the way that the sheep tend to work almost en masse as a flock. And that's what we see very much in the Holman Hunt paintings, that you've got maybe one or two that have wandered off where they shouldn't be, and then the rest of them are all just kind of milling about with nobody to give them any direction. But then they only really become individuals in the folk medicine, and even then it depends on the folk medicine, because it is an individual sheep that you've then slaughtered for the skin to try and cure something, or is it one that you're using to try and cure your rheumatic joints? Or is it one that you're then trying to get it to breathe in your face to cure your whooping cough? At this point, the sheep, again, they're quite anonymous parts of the folklore. You don't really get, in the same way that you did with the horses, you don't get famous legends about specific sheep and things like that. So they're very much this kind of anonymous mass, as it were. But because they were so important to the economy, you can see why they would appear in stories that deter people from trying to steal them and things like that. Or, as I say, the Herdwick one's brilliant because it just shows how hardy the sheep are, because they've got this story where they've basically swum to a beach from after being in the middle of a shipwreck, which is a pretty hardcore thing, I think, for something like sheep to do. But yeah, I just thought it was a really interesting direction to go in with all the medicine, because I genuinely wasn't expecting that, which was quite unusual. But there we go. If you know any particular stories about sheep, obviously feel free to share them with me. That is absolutely fine. I can't remember what we're doing next week, but it'll be either pigs or cows, and obviously goats I was going to try and put in there as well at some point as well, because why not? This is Folklore of Agricultural Animals month after all, so that's the kind of thing that we'll be having a look at. So I hope that you are well. I'm really pleased at the reaction that there's been to Miscellaneous Month last month, because I was a little bit concerned that because it was such a strange collection of posts that people might be a bit like, oh, I missed the themes. But then at the same time, when I first started doing the podcast, there was absolutely no theme whatsoever. It was just whatever I fancied doing that week. So it did at least give me a place to put some of the things that people had requested. And it was quite cool that 3 of the 4 episodes were requests. The Geordie dialect one is clearly my request, but there we go. I'm allowed to do that because it's my podcast. If you do have any requests, as always, you can drop them in the requests form that is linked below. It's always nice to know what people would like to learn about, and because why not? That obviously I want to make sure that you get what you want out of the podcast, because you are the listeners and there is no podcast without you, and so on. As always, if you want to support the podcast financially, you've got a series of ways of doing it. You can buy me a one-off coffee, which basically goes towards helping me to buy books. You can become a member of the recurring subscription on Coffee, which means you'll get the bonus episodes. Or you can become a Patreon supporter, in which case there's way more benefits to choose from, and you can have a look at that, and everything's linked below. If you can't support financially, then just tell a friend, write a review, recommend it to somebody. That kind of thing is also equally helpful and really does help to get the podcast out there, which basically just means that we get to spread the joy. Because as I discovered when I asked about this on Instagram, because I was having a bit of a moment where I was like, considering everything that's going on in the world at the moment, is it a bit frivolous to have a folklore podcast? And the resounding answer is absolutely not. So if you would like to help spread a little bit of the light in the darkness, which quite a lot of people will call in the podcast, then by all means please do tell people about this. Although maybe don't start them off with the morning folklore one, because I don't know that you would call that a light in the darkness, but it was certainly interesting for me, and hopefully whoever requested that topic as well. But anyway, I've rambled long enough. It's been lovely talking to you as always, and I'll see you next week. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee, or you can join the fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.